Alex Parker never imagined his life would twist so strangely. At 24, he was just another broke architecture student in Boston, juggling night shifts at the college library to afford cheap ramen and a shared basement apartment that smelled perpetually of damp concrete. Every night he stacked books, cleaned desks, and dreamed of one day designing buildings that would outlast him. He barely noticed the older woman who sat in the far corner by the giant window until the night the storm rolled in. It was late, nearly midnight, when the thunder shook the old library windows. Most students had fled hours ago. Alex was doing a final round, turning off lamps, when he saw her still sitting there, Eleanor Whitmore. She was always there in the evenings, her silver hair perfectly pinned up, a scarf draped around her shoulders, and thick hardback books on the table. That night, though, she looked fragile. He walked closer, hesitant to interrupt. "Ma'am, the library's closing soon. Do you have a ride?" he asked softly. She looked up, startled, then gave a warm, tired smile. "Oh, I lost track of time. No, I don't have a car tonight. My driver went home sick." Alex could tell she didn't want to call anyone. He offered to pay for a cab, but she shook her head. She was so calmly stubborn, it reminded him of his grandmother. So instead, he grabbed 2 cups from the vending machine, bad instant coffee that tasted more like burnt water, and slid one across to her. She accepted it, chuckling at the bitter taste. They sat for an hour that turned into 3. She asked about his studies. He found himself telling her everything. His classes, how he wanted to design eco-friendly homes that even the poorest families could afford, how landlords never fixed the apartments in his neighborhood. He expected her eyes to glaze over like everyone else's did when he talked about blueprints and building permits. But she just listened, nodding, asking thoughtful questions. Eleanor confessed things too, about her late husband, who'd built an empire of office buildings, but who'd left her lonely in marble halls. About her grown children, who only came around when they needed money. She said she liked the library. It felt alive, she said, full of people who still wanted something. That night turned into a pattern. She came every week, sometimes bringing sandwiches in neat little boxes for him. He'd carry her heavy books. She'd sit and listen as he sketched on napkins. Sometimes they'd talk about nothing, old movies, the weather, stories about her youth that made him laugh. Alex didn't tell anyone. He figured they'd never believe it. A broke student and a real estate queen, talking like old friends in a dusty library. Then one evening in early spring, Eleanor didn't bring books. Instead, she sat down at his desk as he checked in returned copies. She looked different, tired but with a glint in her eye that made him uneasy. "Alex," she began, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, "I need to ask you something unusual." He'd laughed nervously, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Sure, shoot." She didn't laugh back. She took his hand, which startled him so much he nearly dropped the barcode scanner. "I need someone I can trust. Someone who isn't after my money, who doesn't care about my name. Someone who will stay with me until the end." Alex felt his stomach twist. "Eleanor, what do you mean?" She looked right at him then, eyes sharp behind delicate glasses. She told him about her family fighting over her will, about distant nephews plotting to shove her into a nursing home and tear her fortune apart. She said she was tired of watching vultures circle. Then, without blinking, she said, "I want you to marry me." Alex nearly fell off his chair. He thought he'd misheard her. But she explained it all, a legal bond that would make him her heir, but more than that, her shield. In return, she'd fund his final years of school, back his first building project, and give him the stability he'd never had. His mind spun. It was insane. He was a nobody, and she was Eleanor Whitmore. The whole city knew her name. But when she squeezed his hand, he realized how small and alone she really was beneath her grand reputation. He went home that night and didn't sleep. He stared at his cracked ceiling, replaying her words. Everyone would call him a gold digger. He'd be a joke. But he remembered her voice when she said she wanted to trust someone just once more before it was too late. And when dawn broke, Alex Parker made up his mind. He didn't know what the future held, but maybe, just maybe, he could be the family she needed, and she could give him the chance he'd never get on his own. 7 days later, Alex Parker woke up in a king-sized bed that didn't feel like his own. He blinked at the soft morning light spilling through gauzy curtains, the smell of fresh coffee drifting in from somewhere down the marble hallway. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the gold-trimmed ceiling, the polished oak furniture, and the giant oil portrait of Eleanor Whitmore above the fireplace reminded him. He was no longer the broke library clerk living in a basement apartment. He was now the 24-year-old husband of a 71-year-old real estate queen. Their wedding had been small. No paparazzi, no lavish reception, just a quiet ceremony in Eleanor's rose garden, witnessed by her lawyer, her housekeeper, and a disapproving distant cousin who looked like he'd swallowed a lemon the entire time. When Eleanor slipped the simple gold band onto Alex's shaking hand, he'd felt like he was stepping into another world, a world of polished floors, antique clocks, and endless whispered gossip. For a week, they lived together in her sprawling mansion on Beacon Hill. He spent most days wandering its echoing halls, trying to learn which switch controlled which chandelier, how many guest rooms there really were, and why Eleanor kept so many locked doors. They shared quiet breakfasts on the veranda. Sometimes they watched old black-and-white movies in the private cinema room, Eleanor's head resting lightly on his shoulder. In those moments, she didn't look like Boston's iron-willed property tycoon. She looked like someone's grandmother who'd built fortresses around herself for so long, she'd forgotten how to let anyone in. But not everyone was willing to accept their strange bond. On the 7th day, Alex found out just how deep the resentment ran. That evening, Eleanor asked him to dress up. A dinner, she said, with some old friends. Alex put on his only decent suit, combed his hair, and followed her down the grand staircase to the candle-lit dining room, where 3 men and 1 woman in tailored suits were waiting. They all turned when the couple entered, their polite smiles stiff as pressed linen. Eleanor introduced them as her trustees. They controlled parts of her estate, sat on her charity boards, and, as Alex quickly realized, believed they should control her too. Dinner started with forced pleasantries. The older man named Gregory, who wore an expensive watch that could pay Alex's tuition twice over, asked him about his career plans in a tone that dripped sarcasm. Another trustee, the woman, pretended to praise Alex's humble background with a smile so sharp it felt like a knife. Eleanor sat silently, watching it all with a calm, regal expression. She didn't defend him, didn't interrupt. She just let them circle him like sharks smelling fresh blood. Alex held his fork tight to hide his shaking hands. Then halfway through the main course, Gregory leaned back, glass of wine in hand, and said it plainly. "So, Alex, what's it like? Knowing in a few months you'll be the wealthiest young man in Boston, simply by signing your name." The question hit Alex like a slap. The room went quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He could feel Eleanor's eyes on him, waiting. He put down his fork, wiped his mouth, and did something he hadn't planned. He spoke, calmly but firmly. He told them how he'd met Eleanor long before she ever mentioned her will, how he'd sat with her for hours when no one else did, how he never asked her for anything, not money, not influence, not a shortcut out of his miserable basement room. He said he'd marry her again, even if she gave away every dollar tomorrow, because she deserved someone who chose her for her mind, her heart, and her stories, not her net worth. When he finished, the table was silent. Eleanor reached out, covering his hand with hers, a small gesture that made Gregory's eye twitch with barely hidden rage. But the real shock came after dessert, when Eleanor cleared her throat and slid a sealed envelope across the table to her trustees. Inside was a signed legal amendment. Alex peeked over her shoulder as she spoke. With one swift signature, she'd added a clause to her will. If any trustee challenged her marriage, they'd lose their entire share. If Alex left her, he'd get nothing. The trustees' faces drained of color. The sharks had lost their teeth. Later that night, Eleanor and Alex sat by the fireplace. She laughed, a light, real laugh he hadn't heard before, and called him her guardian angel in a borrowed suit. He held her frail hand, realizing the truth. He wasn't just inheriting money or power. He was inheriting a fortress, yes, but also the duty to protect the lonely queen inside it. 7 days ago, Alex Parker was just another broke dreamer. Now, as he looked at Eleanor's peaceful smile, he understood that his real fortune wasn't what she'd leave him. It was what she'd taught him, that loyalty, trust, and courage could build something no money ever could.